Hello and welcome once again to the Joe Roberts podcast. This is part 2 of my podcast titled In Defence of Anarchy. And in this second part of that podcast, I will be refuting some of the common arguments which are made against the idea of anarchy and an anarchist society. Somewhat tellingly, this podcast is actually being made the day after the British general election, which took place just yesterday. That was July the 4th, and so it's somewhat relevant and somewhat pertinent for me to be making this podcast at this point in time. I'm sure you will be aware by now, if you're living in the UK, that the result of that election was that Labour, as predicted, achieved a landslide victory. So, as I said in my last podcast, the first part of that, I said that Albert Einstein once said that insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. And when I heard yesterday that after over a decade of Tory governments that Labour had got back in and were promising to change things and that they were going to make things better for the British people, I got the strangest sense of déjà vu. And the reason for that is we've been here before several times. We've gone back and forth between Labour and Conservative for decades, the best part of 100 years, probably more. There's nothing new going on here. This is where the British people are at. They are repeating the same thing over and over again and expecting to get a different result. However, there was one small piece of information which I did hear, and I thought it could potentially be a sign of hope, and that was that I heard that the voter rate was the lowest in a very long time, and in actual fact there was only a 60% voter rate, or so we're being told. This could actually be a positive sign. That could be a prelude to perhaps at some point in the very distant future an anarchist society, although based on where we are right now, I predict that it could be decades, possibly even hundreds of years away, but it could be an early sign that the British general public are starting to realise that the current political system that we have is in many respects futile, and in order for humanity to move to the sort of next level in terms of their level of awareness and the kind of society we want to live in, it will be required that we take a leap of faith at some point in our future and move beyond the constraints of our current system. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the common arguments made against one potential different type of society, anarchy. And I'm going to refute some of those arguments in this second part of my podcast. So before I jump straight into refuting some of those common arguments made against anarchy, one brief thing that I would like to point out is that, as I said in the first part of this podcast, anarchy is not perfect, and I don't for one second think that if we shifted over to an anarchist society that there would be no pitfalls and there would be no sort of obstacles to be overcome. That would be very sort of fanciful to believe such a thing. However, I do think that a leap of faith is required, and I think it's important to remember that it's possible to critique something whilst still being open-minded, and there's a difference between sort of considered, thoughtful, compassionate, intelligent criticism and reactionary criticism, which is destructive in nature and is designed to sort of create ridicule and derision. And I think where anarchy is concerned, it tends to attract quite a lot of that kind of criticism, the sort of derision and insulting kind of criticism, and I think there needs to be a shift where that's concerned. I think there needs to be a shift where that's concerned, where lots of things are concerned. I think in general, where we're at in society right now, there's a difference between compassionate criticism and destructive, sort of insulting, abusive criticism. And where anarchy is concerned, it's tended to attract quite a lot of derision. So Anarchy is not perfect, and an anarchist society would not be perfect. And if we were to transition from one to the other, there would definitely be pitfalls and there would definitely be obstacles to be overcome. But I do think with willingness and maturity and responsibility and a leap of faith and sort of compassion and love and togetherness and connection and unity being our guide, I think it would be entirely possible for us to construct an anarchist society which did work for people. So with that being said, I'd like to now move on to tackling some of these common arguments made against the idea of an anarchist society. So this podcast won't be comprehensive, so I'm only going to sort of tackle 5 common arguments made against anarchy. The first is the idea of disorder. So the common argument is that without police, without government, our society would slide into disorder, it would slide into chaos, violence, social unrest. And my counter argument to that is that there is very little actual solid concrete evidence to support this idea. Essentially what I'm saying is there aren't enough prolonged examples of anarchist societies throughout history that people can look at and say, well, here's what happened when we tried it and it resulted in an increased crime rate. So there's no such evidence as far as I'm aware, and there are very few examples of anarchist societies that have been tried for prolonged periods of time. There was brief forays into it during the Spanish Civil War, but nothing prolonged. Also, another counter-argument is that the order that we do have is sort of false order. It's kind of a very sort of tetchy, tense, tightly wound order, which is held together by people's sort of belief in and cooperation in the system that we have. It's really people that are holding it together rather than police or government. We are the majority. It's not a police force or the government that are holding things together. It's us, and it's our possibly misplaced faith in this current system which holds it together. And if we decided to deconstruct this and build another kind of system and we placed faith in that, we would be able to sustain that system as well. It's the majority of human beings which create the system and sustain it. Most human beings are not criminals. That's another aspect of this counter-argument, and I don't believe that the vast overwhelming majority of human beings on this planet are criminals, are violent, have an innate desire to do harm to others. I think that's an absolutely ridiculous and completely fallacious misrepresentation of our species. I think human beings at their core are neutral. I think everybody has the capacity to do harm, and I think everybody has the capacity to do good. I don't believe that the vast majority of human beings have a predisposition towards harm. So that's another counter-argument to this idea that without police and government, we would all descend into violence and disruption and, destructive behaviours. Also, another angle to this is that we do have police and government, and we still have crime, and we still have war anyway. So it's not really that good an argument to say that without those things we would have violence and crime, because we have those things and we do have violence or crime. So I would say that the argument that people must be trying to make is that without government and police, those things would be more abundant, and there's no actual real solid concrete evidence to support that. In an anarchist society, order would be achieved and sustained through things like voluntarism, mutual aid, and above all, a strong sense of community, because those things are somewhat lacking in the current type of society that we have. The current order that we have, and I use the word order in inverted commas, is hierarchical in nature and therefore is oppressive in nature. True stability comes from a sense of community and having true control over your own life and a collective sense of community. And most community startups that we see in the current type of society that we have at the moment are anarchist in nature, and I've got a few of those in the area that I live in. There are people who do a variety of voluntary community ventures. The whole concept of that is an anarchist concept. So people are on board with anarchist ideas without actually realising that they are so, and they're operating these ventures independently of local councils who obviously take council tax from us. So people are sort of now getting to a point where they're sort of getting 1 foot in anarchist concepts and 1 foot out of it. What we need to do at some point is place both feet firmly in the ideas of anarchy and take a leap of faith. I'm not sure how close that is, but it will inevitably happen at some point in human history. The second common argument which is made against anarchy is the idea of inadequate security. So the existence of police does not prevent crime. Crime still exists, and in fact there are those who might be inclined to point out that some people in the police force actually commit crimes. Now, there's no evidence to suggest that crime would be worse in an anarchist society. There's no concrete evidence. There's merely speculation. The existence of the army also doesn't prevent war and genocide. We have an army, and we also have, as I'm sure anybody living in the 21st century knows and pay particular attention to some of the things that are going on in the world right now, we have armies, and yet there's an abundance of war and genocide. There's no evidence to suggest that these situations would be worse if our world was an anarchist world. The 20th century was the most violent century in human history, and we were not living in an anarchist society in the 20th century. In an anarchist society, security and protection would be provided by community self-defence groups and mutual aid networks, and they would provide security and protection, and decentralisation of security would lead to less abuse of power and greater accountability and responsivity. It isn't the government or the police which keep our current society ticking over, as I've already said, it's the people, and with it being the people that hold things together now, they would also be the ones that would hold things together in anarchist society. I can't repeat that point often enough. It isn't the government or the monarchy or the police which hold things together right now. It's the general population. It's the majority of human beings. And if we can hold this together, then we can hold any other type of society together. This is one of the most important points I'll be making in this podcast. So the third common argument which is made against the idea of an anarchist society is the idea that there would be a breakdown in essential services in an anarchist society. Now, my counter argument to that is that that doesn't need to be the case, and that one of the principles of one of the sort of common themes which comes up in sort of anarchist literature quite a lot is the idea of developing technologies, and perhaps even moving beyond the current level of technology that we have, but definitely prioritising developing advanced technologies with a view to using them to help humanity. And advanced technologies could help us prevent a breakdown in essential services in an anarchist society, and once again, decentralisation could also help build and manage complex societies as well. I would actually argue that decentralisation of power could be integral to preventing a breakdown in essential services. And if you think about it, it kind of makes sense, because you're placing power in more hands. If you think about that, it does make sense. Now, there are a couple of examples I would like to use to support what I've just said. One is blockchain. Now, blockchain technology is one such technology which would be probably integral to preventing a breakdown in essential services in an anarchist society. It's also an example of a technology which is kind of anarchist in nature. It very much ties in with anarchist principles and beliefs. And there's also open open source software as well. OSINT, I briefly looked into that a while back, and OSINT, sort of open source intelligence software, is also very much anarchist in nature as well. So the idea that essential services would automatically break down in an anarchist society is not necessarily the case. There are many things which could be used to prevent that happening. The next argument which is made against the idea of an anarchist society is the idea that human nature is inherently selfish. And of all the arguments which are made against the idea of anarchy, this is the one that perhaps bothers me the most, because I feel that it's the one that's the most fallacious. Now, I have quite a good understanding of this topic. I'm quite philosophical. I have a very good understanding of human psychology and philosophy and spirituality and all of that stuff. And I can tell you that human nature is neither inherently good or inherently bad. It's mostly neutral, but strongly predisposed towards good. Children especially, there are certain facets to their mind which are highly neutral, highly programmable, so they can go one way or another. And if you program a child in the right way, you can create a real force for good in the world. And this idea that human beings are inherently destructive and selfish in nature really needs to be laid to rest, because those things are a byproduct of the type of society that we have. They are not an inevitability in human beings, they are a byproduct of this current mode of society. And with greater awareness, we can choose more compassionate options. And I think that compassion and a sort of sense of community and togetherness and eventually love, I think those ideas are integral to the idea of an anarchist society. And this paradigm, this current mode of society, hierarchical in nature as it is, it exacerbates selfishness. So I would strongly refute the argument that selfishness is innate to human beings. It's a byproduct of the type of world that we're living in, and that can be changed. Finally, the last common argument that I'm going to discuss in this podcast, which is made against the idea of an anarchist society, is an economic argument. And it's the idea that we need a government to put regulatory frameworks in place that basically allow an economy to run. The argument is essentially that we need a government in order to have an economy. So my counter-argument to that is that there are actually entire theories to counter this, and I'm going to briefly talk about some of those, and then you could do a little bit of your own research if you want to know a little bit more about that, because some of this it would kind of have an entire podcast in and of itself. An anarchist society would have decentralised and cooperative economies. Now, there is a theory behind this. It is the theory of participatory economics, or PARECON for short. And it was invented by a guy called Michael Albert and another guy called Robin Hannell. And if you want to research that further, those are the names that you need to look up. And participatory economics is basically, to cut a long story short, an economic system whereby everybody is involved, everybody has a say, and the economy is basically the responsibility of everyone, and everyone is involved in helping create that economy. Now, there's an entire theory behind it. If you want to know more, I suggest you go and research it, but it is far from the case that nobody has come up with any idea about how to create an economy in an anarchist society, because that's simply not the case. In the same way that somebody had to think up the idea of the current economic system that we have, which, by the way, is largely based on illusion and subterfuge and deceit, somebody also came up with an alternative theoretical framework for how to create an economy in an anarchist society. So I suggest you check that out. So those are some of my counter-arguments to some of the common arguments made against the idea of anarchy. And as I said at the start of this video, this podcast is not comprehensive. There is a lot more that I could say about this subject, and there may very well be a lot more that I will say about it in the future, and I may very well make more podcasts about it in the future. But I think the most important thing that I would like to say, once again, because it's one of the most important points that I can make on the subject, is that the current society that we have is held together by people, the vast overwhelming majority of people. So any other type of society that we endeavour to set up would also be held together by people. And the second important point that I would like to make before drawing this podcast to a close is that although anarchy is not perfect, I do believe it's an improvement on the type of society that we currently have, and I believe that with a willingness to find solutions and a willingness to take a leap of faith, we can at some point in the future create that better society that I think we all deserve. And lastly, I would say that it's possible to critique different ideas while still being open-minded, and I would encourage all of the people listening to this podcast or listening to any new ideas in life to be able to do that. And I think that's just about me finished, and please like, subscribe, comment if you fancy doing so. Bye for now, and thanks for listening.